Hello, everyone, and welcome to our event on Just Transition. And I'm really happy to be representing Just Transition Lab along with my colleagues today. We will be talking about our research projects within the Just Transition Lab across different areas. We will also discuss our policy impacts and engagement and have a chat at the end about incorporating our research into teaching and the importance of doing policy relevant research as well. We are really grateful for your time for joining us today. If you have any questions, please pop them into the Q&A section here on Teams, and we will address them at the end of the webinar as well. So with me today, my name is Daria Shapovalova. I work at the School of Law. I'm a senior lecturer in energy law. I also lead the Center for Energy Law, and I'm one of the coordinators in the Just Transition Lab. With me today, I have my colleagues, Professor Keith Bender at the Business School, Professor Tevis Potts, who's in the School of Geosciences and is a Dean for Sustainability, and Professor John Bone in the School of Social Sciences. But we also have other colleagues at the Just Transition Lab. We were established in late 2021, actually, around COP26, and we collaborate together across different disciplines, from geography to geology, law, social sciences, business and engineering, and now also with our latest edition, Dr. Kate Gormley on biological sciences as well. And our main goal is to develop interdisciplinary approaches to just transition. We operate very much collaboratively in a horizontal manner. So we're all coordinators of the lab, and we are always open to collaborations from within and outside of the university. And we have a wider group of Just Transition Forum where we speak to different researchers across the university. We have various research themes, which we have originally conceptualized for ourselves in the lab. However, I have to say, I think in the last 12 months, we have worked across all of those themes all together. Brian, if you just click through, they will appear on the screen. So I'm the lead on the work around the governance of just transition. So anything around how do we develop law and policy in a way that is evidence-based and that promotes this holistic understanding of just transition. And then comparative examination of transition. So we look at just transition in different contexts and place-based approaches. So for example, how do oil cities such as Aberdeen or Calgary in Canada or Stavanger in Norway deal with the process of energy transition. And we look at what can work in a place-based context and what lessons can be learned across these different contexts as well. In terms of inclusion, participation, and democracy, we're looking at how communities can shape that transition. How can we make sure that we bring society on board with us in this process of decarbonization and net zero? How does society deal with the economic change, with the demographic and social change? And what role does business, market, and politics play in it as well? And finally, in terms of facilitation, demonstration, and engagement, we are trying to work in a very multi-stakeholder setting. So we regularly host multi-stakeholder dialogues. We make sure that we provide links between the third sector, businesses, local government, and national government to demonstrate how transitions can work in actions and how can we build conversations and dialogues around just transition in times when these debates perhaps can become quite polarized in some areas as well. Brian, next slide, please. And these are some of the examples of our impacts and engagement over the last year. So we really try to make sure that as we do our research in a way that is engaging, not just with policy, but also with society, with communities, with third sector, trade unions and workers, but also industry and business as well. So in order to do that, we engage with policymakers, so we hold one-to-one meetings with MPs and MSPs, and I think last year we held about a dozen of those to communicate the findings of our research on measuring just transition in particular. We also regularly give evidence in various bodies. So we gave evidence at the Scottish Parliament Committee on Economy and Fair Work about just transition in North East, for example. Professor John Bone and myself sit on various groups in Aberdeen City Council on local outcome improvement, so on anti-poverty, sustainable city and community empowerment. We are really trying to make sure that we engage with policymaking processes and with policymakers themselves in a way that is informative and communicative and mutually beneficial as well. We work and engage with communities and with third sector. So we have a project led by North East Scotland Climate Action Network, NESCAN, that is called Just Transition Communities Project, which consists of third sector groups, which is geared at deliberative democracy, and we work with them directly on this project. We are also regularly holding events and dialogues where we engage with community members about our research. We've engaged with industry, so we sat on the city level Just Transition group with industry partners such as BP, Shell and Total, which also featured NESCAN and Aberdeen City Council. When our research project was ended, we met with various groups to communicate our findings, such as Offshore Energies UK, for example. We regularly engage with media, so we've given a TED talk at the University of Aberdeen TED last year. We try not to turn down opportunities to be featured in press and in the radio and present our research at conference and events as well. And finally, we incorporate our research into our teaching in our disciplines, and to try and promote interdisciplinary teaching as well. We have launched an Just Transition CPD course last April, and we plan to run it this spring as well. And it is a very interdisciplinary course. Next slide, please, Brian. I will now give floor to Professor Tevis Post to talk about our most recent project, Transacts.
Thank you, Daria. Fantastic introduction to the interdisciplinary work that we're doing in the lab. My name's Tavis. I'm a professor in sustainability and in environmental geography in the School of Geosciences. And what I bring to the lab and to my scholarship in general, I mainly have a background in environmental geography. So how we face issues of sustainability, how we work with different scales and places, how we look at things like communities and how they interact with government, and how we generally progress towards a more sustainable society across a number of different areas. I am predominantly research-based. I have done some historical teaching, but my role at the moment is managing a number of projects, large-scale research projects around just transitions, both in Aberdeen in Scotland and at the UK level, and further abroad as well, for example, such places such as Australia, and looking at those issues in different parts, particularly around energy cities. So I bring a broad array of interests here. Traditionally, I was a marine and coastal researcher, both in marine science and social sciences, and very interested in communities and coastal communities and maritime economy issues. That's brought an interest, long-term interest in energy now, where I'm focused not exclusively, but largely on issues around just transition and transitions in communities. So really interested in those social dynamics, how we engage with different voices and different people in communities, and how we bring that both into our scholarship and how we work with government, and how we also engage with our students as well through research-led teaching. So I'm just going to cover some of the project around Transect. So this is one of our fairly new projects that we've successfully won as a team. And it's a really interesting project, which is about how coastal communities change over time, particularly in relation to energy and changes in energy. And in this project, we're looking at three regions. That would be Orkney in the north of Scotland, the northeast of Scotland, where we're currently based, and in England, Humberside on the east coast, all areas with industrial pasts. We're going to be looking back at least to about 100 to 200 years back in time and looking at how these places, how these coastal economies changed over time, and what can we learn from that, drawing in all sorts of cool stuff like historical, archival, archaeological and heritage aspects to looking at a place, how it changes over time. And then the important question that we want to ask in Transect is, well, how do we actually deal with the future? Because many coastal economies, regions, cities, and countries are changing in response to the challenge of net zero and the climate crisis, whether it's through mitigation and renewable energy. And in Aberdeen, we have a huge research element around renewables and renewable energy, particularly offshore wind. And how do these coastal communities adapt to these changes, and what can we draw upon in their background and their histories and their past to explore ways forward? So this is a really exciting project. It has a number of partners. It's led by Heriot-Watt Aberdeen and is a major partner in it. And we look forward to working on it over the next 4 years or so. And of course, we'll be bringing some of those lessons into when we teach you in our various degrees related to sustainability, geography, biodiversity, economics, the whole range of things that we teach across the university. So look out for us. Thanks, Daria. That's everything I've got.
Thank you. Next slide, please, Brian. So I'll talk about our projects from the position as a researcher. So what I bring to the Just Transition Lab, hopefully, is some background in law and policy, in particular in how we regulate the energy sector in a way that minimizes the impacts on environment, that promotes justice and human rights, and how do we do all of that in a way that is conscious and works in synergy with climate law and net zero targets as well. My Just Transition interests are really in how can we provide evidence and make sure that we have a detailed law and policy that is conducive to outcome-driven Just Transition. And I'm here to talk about a couple of projects. So the first one is the project from the Just Transition Commission, which we are running just now between September and January 2025. And it's on a comprehensive review of various Just Transition initiatives in the Northeast. We have provided a detailed briefing on that, and we hosted the Just Transition Commission together with the UK Climate Change Committee here in Aberdeen. In October. You can see a photo up there on the top. And the idea here is that the Just Transition Commission, which is a non-statutory body in Scotland, established by the Scottish Government to provide advice and scrutinise the policy, is travelling around Scotland to take evidence from different communities and workers and other groups. So we have facilitated that visit and convened a workshop here at the university, and we're now preparing a final report. Another project to showcase is the Just Transition Communities project. So this is a project led by NASCAN, where we're working with 5 other partners. It's funded by the Scottish Government Just Transition Fund, and it is now in its year 3. In this project, in the first year, we held a pilot climate assembly at the University of Aberdeen. And we have provided a literature review on climate assemblies. And we're now working on ensuring that the outcomes of deliberative democracy and various processes associated with it are translated into policy and looking into different ways to make sure that process of translating democratic processes into policy is working effectively. Thank you, and I will now give the floor to Professor Bone.
Good afternoon. My name is John Bone. I'm a professor of sociology, School of Social Sciences. My role in the Just Transitions Lab is to consider some of the large-scale social processes around just transition. Evidently, the energy transition is one of the biggest changes occurring in society at the present time. And this meets with my own interest in social change, social inequalities, social insecurities that people are exposed to as they go through these transitions, as I also have an interest in how insecurity, inequality, social upheaval affects health and well-being. And this relates to my theoretical work in political economy and also in social and biosocial theory. I'm not going to talk about biosocial theory because, as my colleagues would attest, if I start on that, I'll be here for the afternoon. But as I say, I'm interested in social transitions, insecurity, inequality, political stability. And that's part of the kind of interdisciplinary focus we have in the lab. All of us in various ways bring our own sort of skills and perspectives to the lab. But over time, we realized that in order to understand these kind of complex, large-scale transitions, there are lots of different issues involved, lots of different actors involved, lots of different constituencies involved that intersect. And you can't really understand that from a siloed position. It requires an interdisciplinary lens. And that's one of the strengths, I think, of the lab, that we bring that interdisciplinary lens. And most of us have had an interdisciplinary focus prior to coming to the lab, and that has deepened as we've progressed in our work together. And in a sense, what's happened is, as Daria was mentioning earlier, each of us has our own particular fields in terms of the lab's work. But over time, these have tended to overlap more and more as there's been a kind of fusion of horizons between us. So this has been very fruitful for our work. All of us, it's not only provided a new lens on the work we're doing, but it's also broadened our horizons as academics, which feeds into other work we do and feeds into our teaching. Now, one of the projects that was pivotal in that journey is a project that we completed last year. And this was the project Measuring a Just Transition in the Northeast of Scotland. We set out to produce some indicators and measures of just transition. And this was a two-part project. We started off by exploring the field. So we conducted a rapid evidence review on just transition in our own region and globally to uncover some of the main themes. The second part of the project, we gathered data both locally from across the UK and from elsewhere. We also spent time talking to stakeholders involved in the energy transition in various ways. And we produced a measure of indicators across 4 themes: employment and skills, equality and well-being, democratic participation, community empowerment, revitalisation and net zero. Now, what's interesting about this project is prior to this, we got the sense that Just Transition was largely approached through employment and skills, and that Just Transition was about preparing the workforce for a new type of energy economy. But our interdisciplinary approach has broadened the lens on that. We're looking at what happens to whole communities going through this process and how that affects the stability and sustainability of communities, as Tavis mentioned earlier. So I'm now going to pass it on to my colleague, Professor Keith Bender.
Thanks, John, and hello to everybody. So as John said, my name is Keith Bender. I'm a professor of economics in the business school here at the University of Aberdeen, also the director of research for our school. So my background just generally is as an applied labor economist. What I'm really interested in is how workers and firms get together to do stuff or not. And I think what was really the sort of lead in for me to be really interested in what the lab was doing was really sort of from 2 points of view. One is, as John just mentioned, the sort of typical way that people think about just transition, at least historically, has been around jobs and skills. And so my interest in how workers and firms get together or not automatically fits into that. And importantly, a lot of my research before I started with the Just Transition Lab was about thinking about when do those employment relationships actually break apart, and what are the things that are causing that. So it makes a lot of sense for us to be thinking about that from the point of view of an energy transition, or as I'll talk about in just a second, other forms of transition, because those employment bonds, those employment relationships will get broken during those transitions. And so we need to be very cognizant of that and try to make that work as well as possible. In addition to that, I have a longstanding longstanding interest in thinking about the health elements and health aspects of work as well. And so along the lines of John, sort of thinking about how work affects health and health affects work is a key component to my research. And clearly that's another important element of thinking about a just transition. So my role in some sense in this group, at least initially, was really to sort of champion this employment and skills, and particularly how it links with health and well-being. But I will echo what everybody has said here. The real value of what we do as the Just Transition Lab is not in our individual disciplines, however good we may or may not be. We are truly greater than the sum of our parts in that sense, because we really do feed off of each other and help build up this knowledge base around a just transition. And importantly, too, we don't work in the silo of just academia, as been mentioned. We really do co-create the research that we generate within the lab, and then importantly feed that back out to non-academic stakeholders. So it's really important for us. It's a fundamental part of what we try to do. Now, in terms of my own teaching, so we're developing, we all have participated in the CPD module that Daria mentioned earlier. The business school is also coming up with a new MSc in Sustainable Economics and Finance starting in September of next year, and I'll be delivering lectures on just transition as part of that. So it's increasingly becoming part of my teaching as well. The project that I want to talk about that we've been most recently funded to work on is something that perhaps is slightly different than some of the things that we've talked about so far, which have been focused primarily on energy. But of course, if you think about transitions, there are many different kinds of transitions that have happened historically in time. If you think about the coal mines in the central part of the UK and how they declined over time, damaging communities for many, many years, or the deindustrialization that happened in many cities in the UK or where I'm from in the US, those kinds of transitions are important important too. So we were approached by the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority to do a study on a just transition, not around energy, but around a nuclear research facility up in Dounreay. So that's up in the very northern part of Scotland, close to the closest town is the town of Thurso. And in some ways, it parallels some of the things that we've talked about, and we've done research and the just transition around the northeast of Scotland, where you have a dominant industry of oil and gas extraction, and when we transition away from that, what does that mean? Similarly, up in the north of Scotland, in Thurso and Dounreay, you have a very dominant research facility that was instrumental in much of the nuclear research since the 1960s. Very highly paid, highly skilled group of workers that really brought a lot of economic benefits to the wider region. But much like oil and gas in the North Sea, which is being decommissioned, the nuclear facility up there is also being decommissioned. And so the Nuclear Decommissioning Authority was very interested in thinking about and applying the principles of just transition to that context as well. So we're still in the middle of finishing up the research and publishing it. You'll see the front cover of the first of the 3 parts that we're doing. It's a policy report of thinking about just transition in this kind of nuclear decommissioning space. It's really an unusual situation, much more complex in some ways than oil and gas decommissioning and energy transition, because on the one hand, you have nuclear fuels that are very different in the way that needs to be decommissioned, but also you have these remote areas where they're quite remote from centers of government and policy. So we've done a report on the policy framework, and right now we're going through the stakeholder interviews and thinking about and paralleling the ideas that John mentioned about measuring just transition, but putting it into this context of a very rural, small community, but one that has such a major employer in it. So watch this space as we publish these research outcomes in the new year. All right, I think that's all. I'll turn it back over to Daria.
Thank you. I would like to remind everyone to please post their questions in the Q&A section. We have a few questions already here lined up, so I think I'll start with one of them and invite my colleagues to answer as well. So the first question was, how does the panel believe we can measure a just transition? Are there actual metrics we can agree on and use nationally or globally? Maybe I will start with this about our measuring project, and I will pass on to my colleagues after. So we have a paper that is currently in review on this specifically, and this is something that stemmed from our Uplift-funded project on measuring just transition. To be honest, our hope when we started the project was that we're going to find some existing methodology to do that, and we're going to rework it and apply it. And we didn't really find anything that was suitable for our purposes. We found that a lot of existing metrics around sustainability are either too high level for sort of place-based measurement scenario that we needed, or maybe directed at the industry, such as the World Benchmarking Alliance Just Transition benchmark, or perhaps focused a bit more on technical issues of energy transition rather than social issues of justice. So we have developed our own, as John has mentioned, and the way we have done it is we've gone through the process that was based first on background study through rapid evidence assessment, guided by an independent steering group. After studying the background, we have done some participatory research and we've done some workshops with local informants, sort of in local government and third sector and the industry. And we have then gone through an iterative process of developing specific metrics, and those were 20 indicators across the 4 themes. But I think the unique feature of our work is that these indicators are both quantitative and qualitative, which makes the work more difficult because you cannot really have kind of an easy index number or an easy dashboard that presents you with kind of a score. What you have instead is some data, but also some sort of qualitative case studies around specific indicators where data, for example, is not available or where quantitative data does not really tell you the whole story. So I think that would be my answer, but I would invite my colleagues to give their answers as well. If Brian, you can switch all of us on maybe at this stage. Tavis?
Yeah, I think the really important question is you have to decide what you want to measure before you go and measure it and find metrics. I'm quite suspicious of these sort of large-scale just transition indices or even sustainability indices that represent entire countries or large-scale regions. So really, what are you trying to measure is a critical question. And a just transition has been very much about jobs and skills, and there are measures readily available to look at that at quite low levels of scale, which is great. But other areas that are equally as important that we've identified through the research, such as democratic participation and transparency in decision-making, poverty, inequality and marginalization, and community revitalization, are all challenging in their own ways around what measures you select. And it's really how you use those measures. The other thing is that I'll just say about measurement, just transition, is that the lab, the work we do is very much centered about the role of place, and places are different and have different stories and have different economic backgrounds and have different social values. So while there are some important measures at a national scale, we feel that the place where the action happens is at a place-based scale, which could be anything from a suburb or a community to a city or region. So it's what are the places, what are the stories, what are the dynamics of that place, whether it's Grangemouth, which is shutting down its terminals, or oil and gas in Aberdeen, or marine wind in the Hebrides, or any issue anywhere in the world. What's the place tell us about?
John?
Yeah, as I mentioned earlier on this, what we're looking at is a large scale industrial, social, economic, and community change. And there are lots of intersecting factors that interact with each other. So it's a complex process. So we have to look at a broad range of measures. And that's why our approach is very holistic. And this is being recognised by policymakers and research funders of late who have been looking at change in terms of whole systems. You can't really understand the change unless you look at the system as a whole and how the different parts fit together. So there are lots of measures. And what we're looking at is taking the temperature of the well-being, both economically, industrially, communally, in terms of health and so on. And one of the factors, for example, that came out of our measuring indicators was healthy life expectancy, which is a measure of how people are being affected individually by going through the insecurities and upheavals of this kind of socioeconomic change. So there's a broad matrix of measures, not just one indicator, that you need to employ to get a purchase on this kind of change of this magnitude.
Thanks, John. And now for the numbers guy, Keith.
Yeah, no, well, no, I mean, I won't add really anything to what has already been said. You know, it's clear that this is a multidimensional thing, as you would expect it to be in a kind of societal context. I just wanted to say that in the Q&A, I put a link to our publication on measuring just transition. It really has gotten quite a bit of traction, I think, and a lot of interest about thinking about how to do just transition, how to measure just transition, and to think about it in a holistic but also place-based way.
Thank you, Keith. I think we had a couple of questions around the representation of marginalized communities. So there's one that says, how can marginalized communities in the UK have their voices heard in relation to a just transition? Does the panel have thoughts on this or good examples? I think there was another question that read, how can we ensure marginalized communities are heard at each stage of this transition? Well, I think this is why we need a just transition. This is where this whole question of justice has come in. And I really like the definition of a just transition that my colleague Tavis has put together. It's slightly overly scientific, but it reads just transition, don't shaft people. And I think we're all adopted that as we're moving forward. But in terms of representation, I think there's often this assumption that our democracy works. We go to elections, every couple of years, local elections, national elections, and that's democracy, and that's it. But of course, when we talk about energy transition, it affects every aspect of our lives. And the way we see energy transition and justice is sort of this dual role. So first, we talk about the just transition of workers and communities in regions such as the northeast of Scotland in terms of phasing out fossil fuel activities, whether because the resource is running out or for climate purposes. And we have, not just workers, but whole communities being left behind, like what was happened with the coal communities in the past. And the other aspect of it is, as we're moving towards a low carbon industry, we have communities that are more affected by this than others. Particularly, these are communities that have to host the industry. And I think it is evident that so far we haven't really come up with a good system for benefit sharing for these activities. And if we look formally at how their voices are heard, I think we need to make a difference between voices being heard and those voices being taken into account for decision making, because there's plenty of opportunities to have your voices heard, even though the pre-application consultation for renewable energy infrastructure, for example, is not a statutory requirement yet. There is a proposal right now under consultation to make it a pre-application requirement. Many companies do that anyway, engage with communities before they submit an application. But whether that's kind of a placating exercise, or whether it actually has as a goal community empowerment and incorporating those voices into decision making, that's a big question. I don't think we have cracked that nut yet, to be honest, neither in the UK nor somewhere else, because communities should be and are allowed, but it's how these voices are then incorporated into decision making, whether, for example, a community would have a veto on a particular development in their area or not. That is the question, and it's a difficult one to work out, because you don't want to stifle energy transition, you don't want to stall the way to renewable energy infrastructure that we desperately need for both energy security and net zero, but you also don't want to kind of keep doing things the way we have done them before without really listening to communities. Tavis, do you want to answer that as well? Maybe you have better examples than me.
No, it's pretty comprehensive. And thank you for the very Australian definition of a just transition, which I hope gets mandated in law. That'll be really good. So the questions about marginalized people and having them heard and involved are really important. It's very easy to talk about them on paper, and I think that's what's been historically done and traditionally done. But it's really important that we go and talk to marginalized communities and engage with them on their terms, in their own spaces. And often the way that just transitions or even local sustainability movements have evolved is that those conversations can happen in very formalized settings. So it could be a government inquiry or a local government session, or a session on in a community hall, or things like that. And often many people are uncomfortable speaking in those places like that, and we have to be more creative and innovative and better around facilitation and engagement and communication to really get those voices heard and provide the opportunities, not only them to be heard, as Daria suggests, but for those voices to be empowered to drive the changes they need within their communities. And that, I can confidently say, hasn't really happened to date, and that many communities are left out of the energy transition process. They're not getting the benefits, they're not seeing the cheaper bills, they're not seeing the energy security questions or the economic benefits. So a lot of the work we're doing is focusing on these, what you call marginalized voices, and finding pathways for them to build their capacity and their ownership of a transition.
John?
Yeah, I mean, as my colleagues have said, you've covered most of what I would say on this issue. Marginalized voices have been central, and social justice is central to our interest in engaging in this type of work. All of us in various ways have been involved in work that involves marginalized groups on inequalities and so on. Each one of us has done that. Partly our indicators, what we're looking for is a barometer as to how people are doing and whether people are distressed and who's losing out in the community. So for example, as well as healthy life expectancy, we'd look at things like emergency food provision and so on as an indicator of levels of poverty in a place. And we're also not just looking at the data and not just looking at the sort of surface data. We're interested in gaining understanding of the lived experience of people within those communities, because it's only by doing that we really get to understand the impact of the socioeconomic conditions that people are exposed to. And that's kind of what gets us up in the morning. Yeah, it's addressing that, it's understanding that, and providing information to policymakers and so on to try and move the dial and to try and push us towards a transition that is actually just.
Thank you. Keith?
I don't really have anything more to add. I think you all did it right. I'd rather just go to more questions.
Okay, excellent. So the question that's at the top of my screen right now is about different types of alternative energy. And when considering the just transition, how do we determine the most ethical types of alternative energy to pursue? Nuclear, wind, alternative fuels, and how can we transition to using these without further harming those communities geographically closest to these resources? Loaded question. I'll answer as a lawyer. It depends. I think one principle, well, there are a few principles that would be applicable here. And the first one is that we need a more decentralized energy production. I feel like what we're trying to do now is replace centralized fossil fuel-based energy system with a similar low carbon energy-based system. And I feel like that needs to change. We need more community-based renewable production. That is something that has been on the radar in the EU for quite a few years now, with all member states required to promote and provide support to renewable energy communities. It's something that sort of started in the UK and then stalled. I feel like we still have the provision in, I think it's the Infrastructure Act, that the Secretary of State can make regulations to make shared ownership mandatory, but that has not really happened yet. We have some support for community ownership of renewables, both in England and here in Scotland, but it seems like after the feed-in tariff has been cancelled for new projects since 2019, that the process has really stalled. So I think that is definitely needed. And in terms of what type of energy is relevant there, of course, would depend on what kind of resource is available. Again, I don't think I'm most placed to say what is the best energy mix for the UK, but the way I see it, it needs to be a diversified energy generation for both energy security, but also disseminating these different processes across the country, because that's something we see a lot in areas which currently produce a lot of electricity. For example, Caithness and North Sutherland, that has a lot of onshore wind infrastructure, proposed pylons to bring electricity offshore down south. And my perception and feeling here is that if those communities had more benefits from being next to that infrastructure, they would feel much better about it and feel that is more just. Tavis?
So my mic would unmute. Sorry. Every form of energy has its own costs and benefits and impacts, whether it's renewables, whether it's large-scale offshore floating wind, whether it's the infrastructure required around renewables, whether it's carbon capture and storage or nuclear. So it's important to look at each form of energy in the round. The energy quadrilemma is really important. So it's security of supply. It's the cost of the energy. It's the decarbonization elements of energy across the whole supply chain, and it's the social acceptances around the different forms of energy, and that's all different. So we have to explore them in the round. That's something we do. We contribute to those discussions in the lab, where we've got engineering and expertise and economic expertise and legal and social expertise. So we can have those conversations in the round as we look at the various mixes for going forward.
Thanks. John?
Not a great deal to say on this, other than the fact that, you know, a more decentralized system to gives communities a more sense of control as well as cost over their energy sources, rather than being subject to monolithic decision makers at a distance. Certainly a decentralized system and something that is more community based would be desirable.
Thank you. Keith?
Yeah, I'll pick up on the sort of diversification element. I think that's a really important one. I mean, all we need to do is see, you know, what's been happening in energy markets over the last 3 or 4 years, just to realize that having that diversified portfolio of kinds of energy production is really, really important. I think too, as an element to this, is really that engagement with policy. I mean, one of the things that we've found a big challenge that a lot of stakeholders, and it's across the spectrum from business to individuals, is the challenge of governance, because you have these various levels of government. You have local governments, you have national governments as in terms of Scotland, and then you have Westminster governments, and then you have a whole series of other governments in other places that really affect the outcomes in terms of energy and energy prices and all of that. And that's a really challenging mix to try to find yourself in addition to industry being very concentrated, and the big, for example, oil companies in Aberdeen. Yeah, sure, they have an outpost in Aberdeen, but their headquarters are in London or New York or the other places, and so there's this distance element that is also extremely important. So it's a big challenge when you're thinking about this issue of just transition.
Thank you. I will take next question from Magnus Davidson. Hi, Magnus. And I will ask Keith to answer first, because I feel like I'm just blubbering on and not letting anyone develop their own thoughts. And I think you'll like this question, Keith. It's about our work in nuclear decommissioning up in Caithness, and what are the most interesting differences between just transition elements and oil and gas and nuclear decommissioning in our work to date.
Yeah, I saw that question too, so thank you, Magnus. So I think, well, one follows exactly this issue of governance. I mean, one of the things that we found when we were in Thurso and doing our interviews is this real challenge that people felt that the centers of governance were way far away. I mean, the closest one was in Inverness, and as Magnus knows, and the rest of you may not, it's actually a several-hour drive, and then if you take public transportation, it's actually even longer. And that's the closest center of governance. Then you have the Scottish government, which is in Edinburgh, and then you have the Westminster government in London, obviously. And so that kind of disconnect was much more apparent there than it was even when we were doing similar discussions here in Aberdeen. I think there are two other things that sort of really have popped out to me, and I'm happy for others to jump in. Certainly, there was an issue about depopulation, and we know that that's a challenge around many rural areas anyway. But I think that area had been built up so much over the last 40 or 50 years that the communities really felt when people were starting to move away because there was less work or the promise of less work with decommissioning at Dounreay. You could really feel those people slip away. Some of that has happened in Aberdeen as well. I mean, all you need to do is go walk up and down Union Street, the main street in Aberdeen, and you feel that as well. But it seemed much more pronounced there. I guess the third one, going back to jobs and skills, unlike perhaps Aberdeen, which of course is a decent-sized city anyway, and there are lots of opportunities for people to find alternative work, that's not the case so much in a place like Thurso. It's a relatively small town, and there's a lot of demand for some of the skills that are either inherent within Dounreay and the kinds of construction and such that you need around the nuclear power or the nuclear research facility. But then, as Daria mentioned, there's a lot of investment in offshore and onshore wind, so that takes some people who have skills. There's a spaceport that's being developed up there. There's tourism. There's other things going on, and certainly there seemed to be a much bigger, not quite battle, but there was many more pressures on a small group of workers that could easily be pulled in one way or the other. So I think that was the other big difference than compared to what we saw in Aberdeen. But I'm happy for others as they've been going through the research as well. Yeah, Tavis.
No, I was just saying thumbs up, Keith. That was comprehensive. So I have nothing further to add to that. No, it was brilliant.
Yeah, here too. I think I would just only add that I think there were more similarities than differences. Quite striking for similarities, especially in just the amount of people who were discussing the state of the roads as the indicator for just transition as well. But that's, of course, a larger comment about just the state of essential services and infrastructure that people see every day around them as an indicator of how well they're doing and how good their life is. Tavis?
Yeah, you flagged something in my mind there, Keith and Daria, about this idea of community benefits from whether it's from renewable energy or community benefits coming from decommissioning of nuclear. I think that's an up and coming issue, not just in Caithness and North of Scotland, across the board, across the world, how community benefits are applied, because often we see deteriorating social infrastructure, a lot of discussion about transport and health infrastructure in remote regions or in cities in the UK or around the world declining, and not really an adequate line drawn between the green economy and the renewable economy and the net zero economy, and addressing these other areas of massive social concern with work, health, homes and social infrastructure. So really firming up the gap, that applies in their work in Thurso, that applies in our work across the board.
Thanks, Tavis. I think we have a couple of questions about Just Transition in Global South, but before we go into that, I'll just quickly answer to one of the questions, which I feel like was a follow-up to us talking about marginalized communities, and it's about if we looked for someone from those communities to become that voice. I don't think it's kind of one person is needed there, but we definitely are doing that work through the Just Transition Communities Project, for example, who are conducting deliberative democracy processes with a focus on areas of deprivation around Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. So they work a lot with communities such as Tory here in South Aberdeen that are going through quite a lot of challenges with the proposed energy transition zone, areas in north of the city as well, which are some of the more deprived communities in the city, but also areas in the Aberdeenshire. Where is direct participatory research? So absolutely yes, and very good question. And there are a couple of questions here. One about Nigeria. So how can we approach just transition in a situation like Nigeria, where oil community has remained degraded for decades because of oil exploitation, coupled with deep existence of corruption and ever-lingering environmental litigation? And another question about South Sudan. How best can just transition work in South Sudan, where the government heavily relies on crude oil while neglecting the well-being of the community around the oil fields? Would you like to start, Tavis, and I can talk about my equity research and fossil fuel phase out?
Yeah, I've got a PhD student who's just a week before her viva on at least on Ghana, so I'm abreast of some of the issues. So to be brief and to get through some more questions before we finish, from a just transition angle, I think it's really interesting. We've talked a lot about communities, but actually we need to think about also about just transition at different scales. The scale of the international scale, international climate justice, international energy and environmental justice. And often these questions are really present at the moment, really pointed, particularly look at recent COP meetings, COP29s and the previous COP meetings about the role of oil and gas in African economic development. And there are some genuinely hard questions to discuss there about that. And international justice questions around where, if there should be development around oil and gas, where in the world should that be? And the justice questions of places like the UK having developed oil and gas resources for 60 years. So where should that flow, where the balance should be? So there's these international levels of just transition dialogue, which are really important for developing economies. I would also say that looking at Nigeria and the Delta, looking other places, there arguably hasn't been strong evidence of the social benefit of those industries or the energy. We're at points where energy access is very challenging globally, and it hasn't solved that problems about energy access and local economic development, despite oil being in Nigeria for decades. So there are probably strong questions to ask there about how does that relate to communities. And we've been working on, for example, the explosion of microsolar in Ghana, next door to Nigeria, and how communities are creating local economic development because they've got refrigeration, electricity, education, engineering skills. So a different type of energy economy there. But ultimately, it's for those countries to determine how they go forward, but in the context of larger scale COP dialogues or just transition dialogues. But it's a really fascinating question, and we're very happy to explore those type of questions.
Thanks, Tavis. I have quite a lot of students that come from the global south, and I think we always have these conversations at the start of the term. Say, well, why did you want to study in the UK? And say, well, we want to learn how to regulate our natural resources industry the way UK regulated theirs. And I always say, well, I'm surprised you're here, not in Norway. And I think there are scales of this. Of these conversations of how can we regulate natural resources industries in a way that benefits communities and society. And there's a lot to learn from the UK, but I don't think we are by any measure kind of the best system for it. And we're all familiar with these terms of resource curse and a Dutch disease, that whether it's developed economically or economically developing country, management of natural resources requires very careful and informed approaches, which is often very difficult to do if a government is under pressure, if perhaps it's not a very democratic government, if there is any kind of corruption present, because it requires a balancing of multiple interests, of economic interests, environmental and social instruments and scales of local and national. There is definitely principles and lessons that can be learned across different countries, but again, this place-based approach, understanding of what just transition would look like in this particular area is very important. I think an aspect of the Scottish policy approach to just transition about addressing existing inequalities is very important, and that's where a lot of attention needs to be paid to what has the previous resource exploitation activity in places like Nigeria have done in terms of justice, in terms of procedural, restorative and recognition justice? What are the existing inequalities that need to be addressed before we move on to the process of transition? And the whole question of, again, benefits, there's been some recent research done by Semeniuk and others on stranded assets, showing how the financial interests in oil and gas often lie in kind of OECD richer countries, whereas the geographical distribution of the actual fields is not really the same. So we see a lot of benefits of activities around the world flowing to north and west, which of course is not really a representation of global justice. I don't think we had any particular opportunity yet to work on projects with Global South colleagues, but it's something that we are definitely on the lookout for and would love to do in the future. John, Keith, do you have any thoughts here? No? Okay, so we're at 3 o'clock. I don't think we have time for any more questions. Brian, you keep me right.
No, some of our panelists can stay on for a few minutes, but I think we'll need to wrap up very soon.
Okay, I can see one more question if I just scroll through. This seems like a good closing question. The idea of a just transition on a global scale sounds a bit overwhelming. How can we affect change in our local communities or at the smaller scale? John, do you want to start first here?
I think it's effectively people being informed and understanding that they can affect change. This is difficult. I mean, this is highly problematic because we have a political system where we have large companies involved in the energy business. We have the financial sector who are heavily engaged and heavily interested in having an energy system that operates in particular ways and not often in the ways that are most conducive to social justice. And we were just talking about the issue in the Global South, where kind of was reminiscent of what world systems theory, where the Global North has been very extractive, so pushing out social bads in one direction and taking resources in the other. It's difficult for people. We have had a scenario now across the world where the capacity for people to actually, let's say, achieve change is actually moving in the opposite direction. We are moving in a more anti-democratic direction, and that's problematic if we want a just transition. And there are numerous issues associated with that. So, for example, just one minor example is the fact that as we experience climate change, that's obviously a key part of the energy transition. We will likely need people to be mobile again. Human beings have crossed this planet throughout our history, and we now have political systems that want to keep people in place, and that might not be possible going forward. We need to have a rethink as a global society as to how we manage our energy, as to how we manage climate change, and how we manage the democratic participation that feeds into that kind of decision making at the macro level, at the global level. So if that's wittering, I don't know, but we are in a position where we need people to be informed, and we need to have structures that allow them to affect change, and we don't have that at the moment.
Thanks, John. I would like to agree that it is very overwhelming. It's overwhelming to work on. It's constantly conflicting feelings about what to do and what to prioritize. But in a small scale, go reach out to your regional, climate association or some other community group, engage with the community around you, and start with small changes. And I think that goes a long way. I think we have really got unaccustomed to doing deliberation and doing communication. It's really easy now when debate becomes polarizing to hide into our online communities where the algorithm shows us only what we like to see, and we can feel safe in expressing our opinions. We don't necessarily have to argue with people who think differently. But I think it is time to really have these difficult conversations and to maybe not try to find a complete consensus, but to hear the opposing side out and identify areas of convergence and way forward. Keith?
I was just going to make one last point. It's that control deficit, the inability to effect change that we're actually seeing coming out in kind of aberrant ways at the moment. And it's feeding into the volatility of global politics that we're seeing around us. And whether this is frustrations around energy, other aspects of the economy, and so on and so forth. And that's why we need to get back to that kind of grassroots democracy and people having an effect. Sorry.
Tavis and Keith?
I think you've summed it up pretty well. Getting involved locally. There's an explosion of grassroots activity in this space. So go and do a bit of research and look out for some positive examples, actions and activities that are happening in communities either around you, near you, or in the same country. I'll guarantee you will find it. And I think the biggest challenge for achieving net zero and climate change is making it relevant to people. And addressing their concerns about health and security and well-being and housing, and all those other co-benefits. That's the secret to making net zero successful and real for people, rather than just something that's done to them. And Aberdeen is a fantastic lab to explore this stuff. I should add, we are a country and a region, Scotland, and a city and a region going through change from a oil and gas economy to a much more diversified renewables economy, and we face all of the issues we've talked about. It's a great place to research and study this stuff. It's unique, I would argue.
Thanks. And for the final word, Keith.
Oh, excellent final word. No, I mean, I think what everybody has said, and I think this is exactly right, is that yes, you can get caught up in the sort of macro, but I think as soon as you start thinking about the sort of macro elements of just transition, you're back to where almost we started with just transition, to sort of think, well, what's a definition of just transition? Does it come from economics? Does it come from wherever? And it's really, I mean, nothing else than what this whole time that we've been working together has really taught us is that it is place-based, that it is much more of a micro thing to deal with. It doesn't mean that there aren't challenges with the macro, with things that are beyond the control of what goes on in your local communities. But at the end of the day, it really is much more of a micro thing. And I think to sort of say an optimistic thing, one of the nice things about having these discussions about just transition is, as I mentioned when I gave my little spiel about me, is that we have a long history of this kind of resource curse that Daria said, where communities were absolutely destroyed. And there was no discussion whatsoever about what to do about that when the mines close or the factory closes or whatever. And okay, it's not perfect, and we run into all kinds of challenges now, but the good thing is that we are truly talking about it, and there are researchers like us that are trying to engage with it, but importantly, there, as Tavis just said, there are community groups that are also engaging with it, and that's a really important and very powerful way of taking this forward. So, just echo with what they said.
Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for joining. I don't think we expected this many people and so many very exciting questions. Thank you all very much, and stay tuned.